What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Mass Effect 3. Bringing my reviews for the trilogy to a close, but I will be doing Mass Effect Andromeda at some point. But to get the intro out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time. It does mean more than just the achievements. If you want to see everything that it includes, and you're new to the channel, click on the channel. First thing you'll see is a video explaining everything I go over. However, the achievements are included, so if you want to see those, my Steam profile is linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. So first up, I wanted to talk about the changes the Legendary Edition actually made to Mass Effect 3, as there's a few things that are just kind of baked into the game in this version. For starters, the extended cut endings. So this was DLC that was added later originally, but it's just part of the Legendary Edition, which is important as the previous original endings were pretty well universally panned, but we'll get to that. Some other new changes that were made are the galactic readiness has been removed. This was a stat that in the original base version of the game determined your effective military strength, as a big part of Mass Effect 3 is going around and collecting war assets. However, the galactic readiness percentage was the percentage of those assets that actually got used. So the default was 50%, so however many war assets you actually only had 50% as a default, and then there were various ways you could increase the readiness by doing things like playing through the multiplayer that launched with the base game. However, the multiplayer was also removed with the Legendary Edition, which that combined with several of the other methods with which you could increase galactic readiness being sunsetted, made the galactic readiness pretty difficult to actually raise, so it was just scrapped altogether. Now the war assets you have is just the war assets that you have. And last but not least, importing a save. So now, if you don't have a save to import into Mass Effect 3, you can use what is called the Genesis comic. This is a comic that runs you through the major choices of the previous games, which will allow you to set up a sort of world state for you to explore Mass Effect 3 right off the bat, so you don't have to run through the previous games. So something to keep in mind there, though of course you can just import your saves, which will respect your choices as much as the game does anyway. Now let's talk about the story a little bit. I'm going to break this up into two parts. For the people who have never played Mass Effect 3 and are just looking to hear about it a little bit, I'm going to talk about the plot setup and some general thoughts. And then in a timestamp chaptered section, I'm going to talk about spoiler parts of the story that I want to mention in this review, but are definitely very spoilery. So if you want to hear all of it, just keep listening. But if you don't want the spoilers, check out the timestamps. Now, the broad overview is that Mass Effect 3 sees us starting out on Earth, actually. This is because we are grounded for our actions in Mass Effect 2, either simply because we were working with Cerberus previously, or because as part of a DLC, you might have caused the death of 300,000 Batarians. But for one of those two reasons, you are grounded on Earth. The game was apparently originally going to start out with a trial for the DLC, but they decided to go this route instead. But you're on Earth, the Reapers finally attack, and you spend most of the game actually going around gathering up war assets and getting the rest of the races ready and prepared to fight the Reapers on Earth, which is bearing the brunt of their attack. Now, overall, it's mostly pretty good. It tends to focus a lot more on the horrors of war and the terrible things the Reapers are doing, and kind of showing the, not exactly human because there's other races, but the sheer cost of life that the Reaper invasion is causing and just the havoc and misery. However, for the non-spoiler part here, it's mostly pretty good. Like, broadly speaking, as a whole, I like it. However, it does have its weak moments of writing that just don't seem to make any sense. And while I'm sure many people have heard about the endings of this game, without going into spoilers, I found them a little underwhelming, but not as bad as people made it out to be. Now, this is, again, primarily because I'm seeing the extended cut DLC version, so this isn't the launch version of the endings. But while I personally found these endings unsatisfying, I honestly wouldn't call them bad by any means, at least in the current state. I wish they had expanded on more things that you had done previously and kind of where those things wound up, that kind of thing. However, I will say that you do see the endings to most of the plot threads actually in the game, so I can understand why they didn't go that route, but broadly speaking, I wish the endings had just elaborated more. Now, with that said, let's get into the spoiler section of the story. So I want to kick this off by saying towards the end of the game, there's this part where the Citadel gets teleported by the Reapers because they found out that the Crucible, the sort of super weapon that's being built in the background of Mass Effect 3 here, that is meant to be used to fight the Reapers, isn't believed to be a threat by the Reapers themselves. They don't think it'll be built, but they do know about it. And supposedly, the way the game presents it is once the Reapers learn about this threat with the Crucible and the Citadel being crucial to its use, they teleport the Citadel over near Earth where it can't be used for this purpose. However, on a simple evaluation, that doesn't make any sense because the entire premise of Mass Effect 1 was that the Citadel is usually the starting point for the Reaper invasion, because once the Reapers take control of the Citadel again, they can use it to effectively block all use of the mass relays, which stops the interstellar travel, which means civilizations are effectively cut off and useless. However, this plot thread in Mass Effect 3 is supposed to have me believe that despite this being the standard for how Reapers attack, they got to the Milky Way, have the ability to teleport the Citadel and effectively render it useless, but have actively chose not to do so because reasons. It just doesn't make any sense. And there are moments like that where the writing is just really weak and I don't feel like they thought it through. And it makes the end of the game feel a little bit rushed because it undermines the entire rest of the story. If the Reapers could do that, and they always start their invasion from the Citadel, why did they not teleport it sooner, shut the Citadel down, and then Shepard can't go around the galaxy collecting and gathering resources, and then they just win by default? It just doesn't check out at all. However, there are other parts of the story I still didn't like much as well. For instance, the entire premise of the Reapers, they actually explain why they are the way that they are and why they're doing the things that they're doing, and it's a little underwhelming. I found it to be kind of disappointing. I would have rather them just kept the reasoning vague. I don't think they needed to explain this, and the explanation is kind of boring, because what it really boils down to is a big AI was given the task of preserving all life, and they decided the only way to do that was by killing everyone and turning them into a Reaper. And it's just like, I don't know, it's just kind of the most boring version of AI plots that there is, and it's been done before quite a bit. Now, that doesn't make the entire story any less interesting, because at the end of the day, the Reapers are more of a plot device and you could replace them with any big bad evil guy. But they put quite a bit of effort and even one of the DLCs into explaining all this, and it's just like the most run-of-the-mill stuff. And that's not to say it's not well done, it's just a little boring as a result. And then one more thing on the story before we talk about the endings a little bit is Kai Lang. This guy just feels wildly out of place. So he is the elusive man's lapdog. You come into contact with Cerberus again quite a bit as part of the story, and this is usually either in the form of foot soldiers or in important plot moments, Kai Lang. And this guy feels like a Mary Sue character to end all Mary Sue characters. He just is, for starters, incredibly cringy, but not because of what he is or the way he acts, but because it's so out of place to the rest of the story. Like, if you put this guy in a setting where that's kind of the vibe, it would have been fine. But you take this sort of cyborg ninja dude in a game that has been relatively serious up to this point, at least in its concepts and things, and he just, again, feels woefully out of place. It feels almost comical when he shows up, because it's like, what is happening right now? And naturally, he has magical plot armor, which means he shows up multiple times. And I don't know, he got annoying very quickly. And again, mostly he just feels entirely out of place, like he belongs in a different game altogether. It was very strange. And then last but not least, the endings. Again, these were not as bad as I was expecting, but again, that was the DLC version of the extended cut endings. And for the most part, I think they do a decent job of drawing the game to a close. Now, there are mods, etc., and at the end of the day, you can headcanon this any which way you want, but I found the decisions as presented that you can make a bit boring. Now, technically, there's 8 endings. 7 of those are variations of the 3 endings, either red, blue, or green, as people like to put it. And then there is a secret ending. If you shoot the little space ghost kid, the Catalyst AI, the cycle will continue, which is like the bad ending, if you will. So kind of a secret thing you can do, which makes number 8. But all of the other endings are based on how many war assets you have. Now, with the Legendary Edition, this is incredibly easy to just have almost every option available to you, or the best versions of the options, as the war assets being higher tends to give you better options. So these aren't hard to obtain these days by any means, but there's the Destroy ending, the control ending, and the synthesis. Synthesis is heavily implied by the game to be the correct choice. The AI that you're talking to is like, this is the way to go, and now that it's a possibility, it's gonna happen no matter what. So something to keep in mind there, I guess. Again, synthesis heavily implied to be the correct choice, but it basically sees the fusion of human and synthetic, or AIs, if you will. However, I do think it's pretty crazy that Shepard, one person, can just unilaterally decide to fundamentally change the DNA of every living thing in the entire galaxy. And yeah, it's a solution, I guess, but just seems kind of a weird thing to just impose the character's will like that. But moreover, it also leaves the Reapers alive, which I just find very unsatisfying after watching them just massacre people this entire game in a way the game presents as this haunting PTSD ordeal, which is also kind of the case with the control ending. The control ending sees Shepard dying to take control of the Reapers. He becomes the new catalyst, more or less, and is the one actively organizing and pointing the Reapers at what to do. First of all, this makes Shepard less than human, which means you might run into a similar problem just because he's not Shepard anymore. And also, it leaves the Reapers alive, which in my opinion is just asking for trouble. Which brings us to the destroy ending, which is my personal favorite ending, but I would tell you it's also a bit disappointing because this sees us destroying the Reapers, but also the mass relays, which sets the entire galaxy back and all this stuff has to be rebuilt. And it destroys all synthetic beings, meaning that the Geth, Legion, one of your companions, etc., are all just destroyed and could theoretically be rebuilt because they're synthetic. But while I do think this is the best choice for the sake of the ending, I will say that this ending at the same time kind of invalidates a lot of the game decisions because you might have spent a significant amount of time brokering peace between the Quarians and the Geth, which improves both of their lives. And this ending, while great for everyone else, kind of makes all of that work pointless. So, on one hand, I think the endings are actually kind of good because there is no perfect option, which in a world like this, let's be real, that was just never going to be the case. But at the same time, part of me is just kind of bummed out that I can't have my cake and eat it too with destroying the Reapers without killing a bunch of other people. But all of that said, let's finally move on from my thoughts about the story itself and move on to character progression. So naturally, we play as Shepard. If you imported your character, then all of your class and stuff is changeable, which unlike Mass Effect 2 has no narrative reasoning behind it. They just let you do it because, which, let's be honest, is the right way to go. Broadly speaking, this is exactly the same as Mass Effect 2 with the addition of some new abilities. So each class got something kind of cool and new that they could do. For instance, engineers can set up turrets, vanguards get the Nova ability, which does a ton of damage and is hands down the best way to go. But every class gets something a little extra, which makes them more interesting to play. And these new abilities are what actually make the combat really fun. Mass Effect 3 is where the combat finally came into its own and was fun instead of just being present. So in addition to that stuff, the armor system from 2 is essentially the same. You can customize different parts of Shepard's default armor or get a whole set of complete armor that gives set bonuses. However, there are more weapons and more mods in this title. So in addition to just being more weapon options, you can also actually mod them as well to further adjust their stats. And I found this to be much improved from Mass Effect 2, where the weapons were a little on the boring side. Mass Effect 3 definitely changed and moved that around. I was actually having fun kind of picking and choosing weapons for each mission. There's even a weight mechanic attached to these now, meaning that if you're carrying more and more weapons, especially stuff you don't need, your powers take longer to recharge, which means you can't use your abilities as often. So there's some fun interplay there in terms of your loadout you're carrying into the missions, which I thought was a nice touch. Let's talk gameplay. Mass Effect 3, in my opinion, plays a lot like an action movie. There's really only one path forward. You can usually see where it is. There's next to no exploration involved. You can explore the Citadel a little bit, but that is pretty much it. Beyond that, you're going to be traveling around the galaxy, gathering war assets. This is done through the actual missions, resolving disputes, and basically just getting everyone ready to fight the Reapers. Now, in terms of galactic exploration, if you will, the scanning and stuff was very reduced. You'll travel from system to system, do a quick scan of the overview or the map, and then it'll show you which planets have something. And then you can go to that planet and just find that thing, which will usually be either war assets or a quest item that you will then either bring back to the Citadel to turn in, or it will just be added to your war asset pool. However, scanning these galaxies can bring the attention of the Reapers. However, the game autosaves every time you enter a system, so this isn't a threat in the slightest, and more of an annoyance than anything. But when you find planets or get sent on missions that actually have a mission on them, you'll be teleported directly into the mission area, and it's very linear. There's never going to be a question of where to go or what you need to do. It's usually pretty obvious, and the combat is a huge focus, as you might expect. And peppered in between those sequences are conversations where you'll get to make a choice, do some Paragon Renegade stuff, that kind of thing. Now, functionally speaking, this is very similar to Mass Effect 2 as well, as this is a big part of the approach that it had, that they got rid of a lot of the exploration and stuff, which was mostly empty in Mass Effect 1 anyway. And overall, I think this helps the game because, again, they picked a direction rather than trying to flip-flop back and forth between either being an RPG or being an action game. Now, while you're exploring all of these missions and doing all of this stuff, there are a few things to keep in mind. For starters, there are a few soft timers in the game, meaning that some of your side quests, etc., will actually expire if you go too far into the main quest. Now, you can do everything the game has to offer in one go, but you do need to be aware that there are a couple of main story missions that will then progress the story past a point where certain side missions become uncompletable, which will affect your war asset total. But again, in the Legendary Edition, war assets really weren't that big of a deal anyway. But if you want to do all of the side content, be aware that if you go ahead to Tuchanka or Rannoch, you probably want to finish all the side quests before you do those missions. Or at least all the available missions that can be completed. Sometimes you'll get missions well before they can actually be turned in, and in this regard, there are a few guides you can find online that are helpful in determining which missions you should be doing before you move on. Now, let's talk about combat a little bit more. My main takeaway for combat with this game is, again, it's very similar to Mass Effect 2 with a few tweaks, but those tweaks actually make it very fun. So in Mass Effect 1, the combat was kind of just bad. In Mass Effect 2, it was okay. Well, in Mass Effect 3, it's actually fun to play, and this is due to a few changes. For starters, all of the new abilities that the classes got are actually pretty interesting, and they're fun to play around with. In addition to there just being more abilities, it's a bit easier to move from cover to cover. They gave some button prompts to like roll into the next area of cover, so where cover used to be really annoying in the previous two games, it was less of a hassle in this game, which definitely helped the gameplay quite a bit. And of course, as I already mentioned, the weapon variety, there just being more weapons that all behave differently, and all of these weapons can have up to 2 mods on them, which then further changes how they are used a bit. And you have combat that is more interactive than it was previously, and is, as a result, just more fun. And in terms of enemies, they still use a sort of rock, paper, scissors system, I like to call it, with their armor and health. Some enemies will be armored, some will have shields, some will have barriers, all of which are affected differently by different weapons and abilities, so there's usually a right way to approach each sort of enemy with the class that you are playing or with the weapon you are using, and kind of deciphering that can feel like a fun little combat puzzle in its own way, especially when you're playing on Insanity. Now on Normal, if you're using a bit of a min-maxed or high-powered build, it's pretty easy to just demolish everything if you're familiar with RPGs at all. But on Insanity, I found this to mostly be pretty fun, especially with an imported character that started at a higher level anyway. It was a challenge without being ridiculous. Now from here, let's talk about the companions a little bit. Now we're not going to talk about these guys in depth. I will have another video talking about all of the companions from the series and kind of ranking them to my own taste, which will be fun, and I'll talk more about each individual one then. But for the sake of this, there are a few new companions such as James or Javik. Javik is actually from a DLC, we'll double back to that. But for Mass Effect 3, the bulk of the companions are the previous most popular companions from the previous two games. So we get Liara, Garrus, Tali, either Caden or Ashley, whichever one you kept alive. However, despite those being the ones that you'll actively take with you on missions and be with in the Normandy while you're flying around, you will, either through DLC or the base game, interact with every single previous companion that is still alive in some way. Either they will be tied to the main story through major events, such as Rex or Tali if they're still with you, or even the minor ones either get side quests in the base game, or they become more part of the Citadel Citadel DLC. Now, I did want to talk about Javik real quick because Javik is actually a Prothean, presumably the last one, and he was added to the game with the From the Ashes DLC. Now, I mention this because the situation around Javik is very strange. He's a Prothean. He has a lot of history with the Reapers as they wiped out his entire race in the previous cycle, and it is Prothean technology that warned this cycle about the Reapers. So Javik, as you might imagine, feels like a pretty important character to the game. He has a lot of interesting stuff, and there's a lot of things about him that seem incredibly important, and it kind of blows my mind that this was DLC and that he just wasn't part of the base game is really what I wanted to mention here. But he goes from his civilization being attacked, him going into a stasis pod, and then you waking him up. For him, this was an instant, and 50,000 years is gone. So it's a bit of a shock for him to be around, but he offers a lot of perspective on things, especially how the races of this cycle were basically primitive cavemen to his species back in the day, but now they're the dominant ones, and again, it just adds a lot of cool perspective that is surprisingly relegated to what is technically a DLC. From there, let's talk about the other 3 major DLCs. These are Omega, Leviathan, and the Citadel DLC. So Omega is pretty fun, actually. This sees you retaking Omega from Cerberus, which was a location that you explored in Mass Effect 2. And while it is pretty cool, sees you interacting with some new companions on a mission. You actually get to see a female Turian, which is one of the, I believe, 2 in the entire series. But the situation around how Cerberus took Omega is actually played out with comics outside of the game, which I think is a real bummer, as technically what we're seeing with this DLC is just the end to that plot thread, but nonetheless actually a pretty fun little DLC that sees you interacting with new companions and has a cool little story to tell. And then we have honestly probably my personal favorite, and that was Leviathan. Leviathan seeks to explain the origins of the Reapers, who built them, and why for what purpose. It does not explain why the Reapers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. However, it does explain where they came from, and their progenitor race, if you will. Overall, though, very cool DLC. It had this sort of cosmic horror vibe to it. The game tried some new things, and I think mostly it worked pretty well. I liked the Leviathan DLC a lot. It just wasn't what I expected in a really good way. And that brings us to the infamous Citadel DLC, everybody's fan favorite, if you will, and that is because basically everything about this is pure fan service, and it's a lot of fun for it. Now, I would tell you, tonal-wise, it's a little strange going from the world is absolutely ending to let's go party it up on the Citadel. Now, there is a story that is involved with this that is a little more action-oriented and kind of explains why you're there, which I do think helps explain the tone shift. But that one little quibble aside, the rest of the DLC is honestly pretty great. It gives you a lot of time to interact with all of the previous characters that you've developed relationships up with to this point, as I'm sure everyone's aware. But you also get to see these characters cut loose and do something besides, deal with a life or death situation. So in that way, it's a lot of fun. The stakes are a bit lower than usual, which I think allowed the writers to do some fun things with each of the characters. And the end of the DLC is just a big party between all of these characters, and you see them talk and interact. They take a big photo at the end. Again, ton of fan service, but a lot of fun, and I think it's worth it if nothing else, just for that. Now, broadly speaking about the DLC before we move on, I do think it's important to know what the DLCs are before you start the game, purely because if you don't know what they are, or specifically what starts them, it's very easy to get trapped in these DLCs for several hours before you're ready to, as once you're in these DLCs, you can't really leave until it's done. Now, each DLC doesn't necessarily lock you in immediately, so it's worth looking up the exact points at which you can't step out of the DLC and you're kind of going to be stuck doing this thing for a couple hours, as if you're not ready for it, it can be not a good time. But from there, let's move on to positives, negatives, and then wrap this thing up with a conclusion. So, positives, surprisingly, the combat. I enjoyed the combat of Mass Effect 3 a lot. It was a lot of fun. Another positive, I think, is just purely the fact that the Legendary Edition removed the readiness factor. I was looking some of the stuff up that went into Galactic Readiness, and it's a lot of integration with other forms of media and other stuff you had to do to increase the readiness, and it sounded like just such a headache. I can see why they were like, let's just get rid of this for the Legendary Edition, and I'm glad it's not here. It sounded awful. And another big positive is that we see all the conclusions to these story arcs and the culmination of all these events, and again, it's just really satisfying to see all of this stuff play out and kind of interact with the decisions you've made previously, even if they were kind of small. For instance, if you even just completed certain side quests and then talked to a certain character all the way back in Mass Effect 1, you might very well see the conclusion to that in Mass Effect 3, and there's a lot of little moments like that that are really cool and hard to quantify. But that, of course, brings us to the negatives, and as I've already mentioned, the writing is just kind of weak in places. Without going into spoilers, I won't go too far. You can check out my spoiler section if you want more information on that and a bit of an elaboration, but there are moments of the story that just don't really make any sense, and it feels a bit rushed as a result, or at least those parts of the game do. Another big negative is that the choices you make throughout the series don't really impact the ending much at all, outside of do you have enough war assets to unlock said ending. But with the Legendary Edition, that's even less so the case now, because the required amount of war assets and the lack of readiness make those minimums very easy to reach. But even ignoring the war asset part of it, your choices just don't really impact the ending much at all, which makes the endings themselves feel a bit undercooked, for lack of a better term. It just feels like there could have been more here, or more of an elaboration. And while the endings, again, aren't really bad, I think there just could have been more to them, even with the extended cut DLC, which helped out a bit, because I would have just loved to, for instance, hear about what characters went on to do, or how certain situations resolved themselves in light of certain ending, that kind of thing. But thankfully, due to things like mods or just your own headcanon, it is nonetheless easily overlooked, which brings me to the conclusion of this video. Overall, I think Mass Effect 3 is actually pretty great, and it has certainly left its legacy on a generation, as the stories they told here with the companions and everything are things that have affected quite a bit of people, as you might imagine. This is a very large franchise, and you hear things about it or the characters constantly, and even if the ending is a bit underwhelming, I wouldn't let that distract you from the fact that the rest of the game is really great, and you see all those interactions with the characters while you're actually playing the game. And while wrapping up a trilogy like this, I don't think was ever going to please everyone in any way. What's here with Mass Effect 3 is actually a really good time if you're willing to overlook a few minor problems. Do I wish the writing was a little bit better? Yeah. Do I wish the endings were more fleshed out? Absolutely. But in spite of those things, I still had a ton of fun playing Mass Effect 3, and it was really satisfying seeing the conclusion of my interaction with all of those characters. And last but not least, Mass Effect 4 has been confirmed, so I'm very curious how they're going to advance the story from here. Now, Andromeda obviously didn't really do this at all. It just sidestepped everything by being in a different galaxy, is my understanding. So mostly I'm just curious how they plan on continuing the story forward. I assume they would probably just pick a canon ending of these three, but that just inherently strikes me as the type of decision that is going to piss off somebody. And given the previous history with Mass Effect and just fans being really upset about the direction, I'm just curious to see that play out. Either way, there's the conclusion to the Mass Effect trilogy from me. Honestly, I can see why people love it so much, but we'll talk about that more and my thoughts about the entire series in an upcoming video, so subscribe if you want to check that out. If you liked the video, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.